In the last journey of Harold Lewis, an elderly man's quiet wish to fulfill a promise to his late wife takes an unexpected turn when a kind stranger steps in to help. What starts as a solitary journey to a cherished lakeside spot becomes a powerful tale of reconciliation, hope, and the healing power of community. As Harold's estranged son arrives with a long-kept secret, emotions run deep and long-buried truths emerge. Will this final trip be the bridge that mends their broken relationship? Can a simple act of kindness rewrite the last chapter of a life defined by love and loss? The city seemed colder that December, its wind slicing through the narrow streets like an invisible blade. At the corner of Pine Street, an old brownstone building stood with weary bricks, its window adorned with an antique lace curtain pulled slightly to one side. Behind it sat Harold Lewis, a man who had seen 82 winters come and go. He clutched his worn leather journal close to his chest as if it were his only friend. The room around him was a testament to time. A faded armchair, a coffee table with chipped edges, and walls filled with framed photographs of a younger Harold with Margaret, his late wife. In these pictures, Harold's eyes sparkled with a light that had long since dimmed. The building's creaks echoed with whispers of the past, blending into the faint hum of the city. But today, something was different. Harold's gaze was fixed not on the bustling streets or the faraway snowflakes dancing in the wind, but on the yellowed page of his journal where he had scrawled, "Promise her the lake, Margaret's favorite place, a small, serene lakeside town 2 hours from the city, where they had shared countless memories of laughter and soft-voiced secrets." Before her illness took her, she had made him promise to visit once more and bring with him the warmth of their love, even if she could not. But now, old age and illness had made the journey impossible. Harold, frail and alone, resigned himself to knowing that some promises were destined to be broken, or so he thought. That evening, as the sky turned a dusky pink, a knock at Harold's door startled him. It wasn't the landlord or a neighbor who checked in from time to time, but a face new to the old building. Maya, a young nurse who had recently moved into the neighborhood, stood there, holding a basket of fresh bread and a tentative smile. She had heard whispers of the elderly man on Pine Street, the one with the stories and the haunted eyes. "Hello, Mr. Lewis," Maya said, her voice soft but unwavering. Harold's brows knitted, his eyes scanning her face for familiarity. I don't know you, do I?" Harold replied, the gravel of his voice betraying both surprise and hesitation. "No, sir," she said, her smile widening. "But I know loneliness when I see it." Harold shifted in his chair, the fabric beneath him groaning with the weight of old bone. He wasn't used to visitors, especially not those with eyes as bright and curious as Maya's. She stepped inside, the scent of the bread mingling with the faint aroma of dust and peppermint that filled his room. Harold's fingers tightened around the journal, knuckles turning white as if he feared the intrusion would pry loose secrets long buried. Maya took in the room with a practiced glance, her gaze softening as it landed on the wall of photographs. She recognized the look in Harold's eyes, the ache of memories that kept a man company in his solitude. "I thought you might like some company," she said, placing the basket on the coffee table. "It's getting colder, and it's no good being alone." Harold's lips twitched, an almost smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I appreciate it, miss, but I'm not much for company these days," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. Maya's expression didn't falter. Instead, she eased herself into the chair across from him, uninvited but unthreatening. "Then maybe I'll just sit here for a while," she said, folding her hands in her lap. The silence that followed was thick, filled with the distant sounds of car horns and the occasional bark of a dog. Harold stared at the basket, the warmth of the bread seeping into the air, reminding him of Margaret's kitchen, a place filled with laughter and the clatter of dishes. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, Harold finally spoke, his voice softened by an edge of nostalgia. "This bread smells just like hers," he whispered, more to himself than to the stranger before him. "Like whose?" Maya asked gently. "Margaret's," he said, the name slipping from his tongue like a prayer. He looked up, surprised at himself for saying it aloud, as if uttering her name was an invitation for the pain to resurface. The lines on his face deepened, eyes watering under the weight of her memory. Maya leaned forward, catching the glimmer of tears he refused to shed. "Tell me about her," she said, and for reasons Harold couldn't fathom, he did. He spoke of Margaret's laughter, of the small hidden dimples that appeared when she was truly happy, of their shared days by the lake, where time seemed to stop, and every ripple on the water mirrored the joy they felt. As the hours passed and the room turned from the warmth of evening to the quiet chill of night, Maya listened, never interrupting, just nodding and offering an occasional smile. When Harold's words trailed off and silence claimed the space again, he glanced at the journal still held tightly in his grasp. "I made her a promise, you know," he said, his voice cracking like the first sign of ice breaking on a frozen river. "But I'm too old, too tired now to keep it." Maya's eyes fell on the journal, a spark of realization lighting within them. "Maybe," she said slowly, "there's a way to keep that promise yet." Harold's eyes met hers, a mixture of hope and doubt. He almost laughed at the idea, but something in Maya's determined expression kept him silent. It was a look he remembered well, the same resolute gleam Margaret would wear when she made up her mind. Maya's words hung in the air like a dare, daring hope to bloom in a place it hadn't touched in years. Harold shifted his gaze from her eyes to the journal, tracing the cracked leather cover with trembling fingers. He wanted to believe her, but the years of solitude and disappointment weighed heavily on his spirit. The next morning, Harold awoke to the sound of gentle knocking. Confused, he pulled his robe tight around his thin frame and shuffled to the door. Maya stood there, cheeks flushed from the chill, holding a paper map and a bundle of scarves. "I've been thinking about what you said," she announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "And I have a plan." "A plan?" Harold repeated, one eyebrow raised. He could not remember the last time someone's excitement was directed toward him. The room seemed suddenly brighter, as if the light had been coaxed back into it. "Yes," Maya said, spreading the map out on the coffee table, pushing aside Harold's empty teacup. The map, worn and frayed at the edges, displayed the route from their city to a small dot labeled Lake Amara. Harold's eyes softened at the sight, the name conjuring memories of laughter that once floated across the water like echoes. "I asked around the building this morning. People know you, Mr. Lewis," Maya continued, her voice steady. "They remember how you used to help their kids with homework, how you taught lessons at the community center. They want to help you now." Harold's breath caught in his chest. Help? For him? The idea seemed almost foreign. "I don't need anyone's pity," he muttered, looking away, but the sharpness in his voice was dulled by the tremble of uncertainty. "It's not pity, Harold. It's kindness," Maya said firmly. "You once gave to others. Let them give back to you." Before Harold could protest, there was another knock at the door, followed by the shuffle of feet. Neighbors began to fill the small space, each carrying something: a warm blanket, a tin of cookies, a thermos of tea. A man Harold faintly recognized from the second floor stepped forward, holding a set of car keys. "Mr. Lewis, I have an old van. It's not pretty, but it runs. If you're going, it'll get you there," the man said, his voice rough but sincere. Harold looked around, stunned into silence. The room, which had always felt like a cage, now thrummed with warmth. Faces he hadn't seen in years, faces he thought had forgotten him, looked at him with soft eyes and smiles that spoke of shared humanity. Maya touched his arm lightly. "You're not alone, Mr. Lewis," she said. "Not anymore." The days that followed were filled with preparations. Maya and Harold spent hours talking about Lake Amara, recounting stories as she packed provisions for the journey. He told her about the day he first met Margaret, how she had dared him to swim across the lake in one breath, and how on that sunny afternoon he had fallen in love with her wild spirit. The day of the trip dawned cold but clear. Harold stood outside, bundled in layers, the weight of anticipation making his heart race. The old van, decorated with hastily tied streamers and a sign that read, "For Love's Promise," awaited them. Neighbors gathered to see him off, their cheers echoing in the street. "Are you ready?" Maya asked, her eyes searching his. Harold nodded, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "For the first time in a long time," he whispered. "I am." Maya smiled, helping him into the van and settling beside him. As the vehicle sputtered to life and pulled away, Harold turned to watch the crowd waving goodbye, their faces blurring through the frost-glazed window. He pressed his hand to his heart, where the journal rested in his coat pocket, and let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. The city shrank behind them, replaced by open fields and winding roads, each mile taking him closer to the memory of a promise made, and now, perhaps, a promise kept. The road stretched out ahead like a ribbon, winding through patches of barren trees and fields blanketed in frost. The silence in the van was broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional creak of Harold's seat as he shifted to look out the window. The landscape rushed by in muted tones of gray and white, but in Harold's mind, each mile brought back a vivid color of memory: the cobalt blue of the lake, the deep green of the willows, the amber of Margaret's eyes when they caught the light. Maya, glancing over, could see the way Harold's gaze had softened, as though he were already somewhere far from the present. She reached over and turned the small radio dial, tuning into a station that played a gentle melody. The notes floated between them, sparking a memory in Harold that made him chuckle unexpectedly. "What is it?" Maya asked, her voice gentle but laced with curiosity. "Margaret," he said, his voice caught between joy and ache. "She used to sing this song while she cooked, always out of tune, but she'd say that it was the song's fault, not hers." Maya laughed, and the sound felt like an embrace. "I wish I could have met her," she said. Harold nodded, eyes misting over. "You would have loved her. Everyone did." They stopped once for a quick meal at a roadside cafe. The waitress, a young woman with a bright smile, brought Harold a cup of tea and noticed his frail hands trembling as he reached for it. She wrapped his hands in hers for a moment, saying, "Take your time, sir. No rush today." The small act of kindness warmed him, and he murmured his thanks, eyes meeting Maya's with a glimmer of gratitude. Back in the van, as the sun began to dip, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Harold's demeanor shifted. He grew quieter, the anticipation laced with a subtle anxiety that Maya didn't fail to notice. The road signs announcing the distance to Lake Amara came into view, each one tightening the knot of emotions in Harold's chest. "What if—" Harold paused, his voice breaking like an old string. "What if it's changed too much? What if I can't recognize it anymore?" Maya's eyes softened. "Places change, Mr. Lewis, but memories don't. You'll find it, I promise." They turned down the final road, a narrow path flanked by bare trees that rustled in the breeze. The lake came into view slowly, a sheet of silver under the soft light of twilight. Harold's breath caught in his throat as he gazed at it, the years falling away like the brittle leaves of autumn. Maya parked the van and stepped out to help Harold. His legs felt weak, trembling not from age but from the weight of so many emotions crashing into him at once. He leaned on her arm as they walked to the water's edge, the air crisp and heavy with silence. The lake mirrored the sky, its surface rippling gently as if welcoming him back. Harold reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the journal, fingers shaking as he opened to the page he had read countless times. Promise her the lake. The ink was faded, but the words carried the same urgency, the same love. Tears gathered and spilled down his cheeks as he whispered, "Margaret, we made it." Maya stepped back a pace, giving him space, watching with eyes full of unshed tears. She didn't need to hear the words to understand their meaning. The wind picked up, cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and something else, something warmer, more familiar. Harold smiled through his tears, feeling, for the first time in years, the gentle brush of Margaret's presence. "Thank you," he said, turning to Maya, his voice stronger now, filled with something that was almost peace, "for bringing me home." She nodded, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't expected. The sky darkened, stars beginning to wink into view as if the world itself were acknowledging this moment. They stayed like that for a while, Harold's eyes fixed on the horizon, Maya by his side, both of them wrapped in the quiet triumph of a promise kept. As the stars sparkled against the deepening night sky, Harold closed his eyes, savoring the moment that felt both timeless and fleeting. The lake was unchanged, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. He could almost hear Margaret's laugh, light and playful, mingling with the rustling of the willows that framed the shore. Maya stood a respectful distance away, watching as Harold seemed to transform before her eyes. The years of solitude and longing etched into his face, smoothed ever so slightly, replaced by something softer, something fulfilled. She glanced back at the van, where the warm light of the cabin glowed softly, and was startled by the sound of an engine approaching. A car pulled up, its headlights cutting across the darkness. Harold turned at the noise, the reverie interrupted. Maya stepped forward, shielding her eyes as the vehicle parked and the engine shut off. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette familiar in an aching way. "Dad?" The voice was deep, tentative. Harold's breath caught in his chest, eyes widening as he took in the figure of his son, David, who he hadn't seen in over a decade. The last time they'd spoken, harsh words had cut deeper than either of them had admitted, leaving wounds that festered in the silence that followed. "David," Harold whispered, the name like a lost prayer. He took a shaky step forward, knees threatening to buckle beneath him. Maya instinctively moved closer, but held back, sensing that this moment wasn't hers to interrupt. David's expression softened as he stepped into the moonlight. His face, so similar to Harold's, was marked by lines of regret and sleepless nights. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he struggled for words. I heard what you were doing. Neighbors called me, said you were heading out to Lake Amara." The quiet confession hung in the air. Harold's eyes glistened, and he reached out a hand, palm open, trembling with both fear and hope. "I made her a promise," he said, voice cracking under the weight of his years and the sudden presence of his son. "And I didn't think I could keep it alone." David stepped closer, his own eyes bright with emotion. He clasped his father's hand, the touch firm, bridging the chasm that had grown between them. "You're not alone, Dad," he said, his voice steady now. "You never were. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that." The wind picked up again, carrying with it a sound that made Harold's heart stutter, a faint familiar hum. It was Margaret's song, the one she always sang out of tune. Harold's knees gave way, and David caught him, holding him close as they both wept, years of guilt and silence dissolving in the embrace. Maya turned away, tears streaming down her face. This was not the reunion she had envisioned, but it was one that felt deeply, achingly right. She stepped back to the van to give them space, feeling the quiet hum of satisfaction in her chest. The lake, the moon, and the stars bore witness as father and son stood together, their shadows merging on the cool, glistening shore. The night deepened, the water lapping gently at the shore, echoing with the quiet reverence of promises kept and forgiveness found. Harold pulled back, looking up at David, his eyes still wet, but his expression peaceful. "She's here, David," he whispered. "I can feel her, and she'd be so proud." David nodded, unable to speak, the lump in his throat making words impossible. They stood side by side, gazing out at the lake, its surface now speckled with the light of 1,000 stars. The weight of unspoken apologies and forgotten laughter lifted, leaving only the quiet assurance that love, once given, never truly fades. The night deepened, wrapping the world in a hushed blanket of stars and shadows. Harold stood, his frail body leaning slightly into David's sturdy frame, feeling the warmth of the moment seep into his bones. It had been so long since he had felt the simple comfort of not being alone. He turned his eyes to Maya, who stood a respectful distance away, and managed a nod of gratitude. Her eyes, reflecting the silver of the moon, glistened as she returned the gesture. "Dad," David said, his voice breaking the silence, "there's something I've kept from you." The words seemed to tremble in the air, heavy with years of hesitation. Harold's brows knitted, the joy of their reunion briefly shadowed by concern. David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges as if it had been handled 100 times. He unfolded it slowly, holding it out for Harold to see. Harold's fingers, thin and lined with veins like an old map, accepted the paper. He squinted at the handwriting, recognizing it instantly. Margaret's looping script. A note written in her gentle but firm way read, "If the lake calls you back, bring him with you. He'll need it as much as you do." Harold's eyes flew to David, disbelief and understanding clashing in his expression. "You had this all along?" he whispered, his voice catching as realization settled over him like the dawn. David nodded, tears threatening to spill. "She left it for me after that last visit, but after we stopped talking, I didn't know how to give it to you. I didn't think I deserved to." The confession, raw and vulnerable, hung between them, a painful echo of all the years lost. The wind picked up again, and for a moment Harold felt Margaret's presence stronger than before. The air seemed warmer, carrying with it the scent of lilies and pine, her favorite combination. A soft, almost imperceptible pressure rested on his shoulder, and he closed his eyes, knowing that some moments transcended reason. "It doesn't matter now," Harold finally said, his voice steady and sure. "You're here. That's all she wanted." David's eyes searched his father's face for any sign of bitterness, but found none. Relief coursed through him, washing away the guilt that had knotted his heart for years. He looked at the lake, its gentle ripples whispering in the moonlight, and felt the same sense of peace that Harold did. Maya stepped forward then, her presence as soft as the night air. "Mr. Lewis," she said, voice hushed, "would you like to write one last note in your journal? Something for her?" Harold's eyes lit up at the thought, and he nodded. With shaky hands, he took the pen Maya offered and opened the journal to a blank page. The sound of pen on paper was the only noise, a gentle scratching that held the weight of decades. He wrote slowly, each letter a tribute, each word a farewell and a promise in one. "Margaret, I kept it. He came with me, and so did she." When he finished, Harold let out a long breath, one that seemed to carry with it every ounce of longing, every unspoken word, and every lonely night. He closed the journal, pressing it to his chest as tears streamed down his face. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch both grounding and light. "It's time, isn't it?" she asked, not expecting an answer. Harold nodded, smiling through his tears, feeling the gentle pull of release. The three of them stood together, silhouetted against the vast star-speckled sky. The lake before them no longer just a place but a symbol, a testament to promises kept, to love that endured beyond the grasp of time, and to the power of kindness that bridged even the deepest rifts. The first light of dawn painted the sky with soft hues of purple and gold, casting a warm glow over the lake. Harold stood quietly, watching the water shimmer under the gentle touch of morning. The exhaustion in his body was now mingled with an unfamiliar peace, a peace that wrapped around him as softly as Margaret's voice once had. David shifted beside him, the silence between them no longer filled with unspoken regret, but with shared understanding. He placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, the gesture tentative yet deeply meaningful. Harold looked up at his son and, with a soft smile, covered David's hand with his own. The years of silence, of pride and hurt, dissolved in that simple touch. Maya watched from a few steps away, her heart swelling at the sight of their reconciliation. She had come into Harold's life expecting to provide comfort for a lonely man, but she had found herself witness to a story of love, loss, and redemption that spoke to something deeper within her. The kind of story that reminded her why she had chosen to become a nurse in the first place, to be there, not just for the living, but for the parts of them that needed healing. Harold turned to face Maya, eyes reflecting gratitude too deep for words. "You did more than you know, young lady," he said, voice rough but full of warmth. Maya shook her head, a tear escaping down her cheek. "You already had what you needed, Mr. Lewis. I just helped you see it." The three of them sat on the wooden bench that faced the lake, the cold wood beneath them a sharp reminder of the present moment. Harold opened the journal once more, tracing the last words he had written. He handed it to David without a word, the gesture both a gift and a passing of a legacy. David took it with reverence, his eyes filling as he understood the significance. The wind picked up, playful and brisk, rustling the leaves and sending a flurry of golden brown across the path. It was as if the lake itself sighed in contentment, holding the memory of Margaret's voice in its ripples. the echo of her laughter in the dance of the wind. Harold closed his eyes, breathing in deeply, feeling her presence not as a ghost, but as a promise kept, whole and unwavering. David looked out at the water and spoke softly. "We should come here every year, Dad. Keep her memory alive." Harold's eyes, still closed, crinkled at the corners as a smile spread across his face. "Yes," he whispered, "we should." The morning sun grew stronger, and with it came the chatter of birds and the soft rustle of life awakening around them. It felt as though the lake, the trees, and even the sky were nodding in quiet approval, bearing witness to the healing that had taken place. Maya stood, dusting off her coat, sensing that this chapter had found its ending. "I'll leave you two to it," she said, stepping away with a smile that lingered. Harold's voice stopped her before she could move further. "Maya!" he called out, his voice as steady as it had ever been. "Thank you for your kindness." She smile widened and nodded, without realizing what those words meant at that moment. As she walked back to the van, the sounds of father and son talking behind her, Maya felt a deep, unshakable sense of fulfillment. The road home would be long, but her heart carried the weight of something profound, a reminder that even in life's final chapters, connections could be forged, promises could be kept, and kindness, always, had the power to heal. The sun climbed higher into the sky, its golden rays spilling across the lake as morning birds began their song. Harold sat on the bench, his face peaceful. Beside him, David remained still, his hand resting lightly on his father's shoulder, sensing something had changed. The serene silence of the moment was broken by the realization that Harold's breaths had softened into stillness. Maya, standing nearby, froze as her gaze fell on David's trembling hand. Slowly, he turned to look at her, his deep brown eyes filled with unshed tears. "He's gone," David whispered, his voice breaking as the words took shape in the air. Maya hurried to them, her heart heavy as she knelt by Harold, her hand resting gently over his. His face bore a soft smile, as if he'd drifted into the embrace of a dream, carried by the memory of Margaret and the lake they loved so dearly. David let out a sob, leaning into Maya's support as the weight of both grief and gratitude overcame him. As they prepared to leave, Maya placed a hand on David's arm. "He found peace," she said softly, her voice steady despite her tears. "And now, he's with her." David nodded, clutching the journal as if it held all the pieces of his father's life and love. Together they stood, looking out at the shimmering lake one last time before turning away, knowing that Harold's journey had ended, but his legacy lived on in their hearts. Thank you for being part of Harold's heartfelt journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more inspiring tales of love, resilience, and kindness. Share your thoughts in the comments below and help spread the message by sharing this story with others who need a little hope today.